we often sit with anticipation, waiting for God's answer to prayer, for God's grace or will to be revealed. Sometimes that's with great eager anticipation, like what we hear in the gospel today, as all sat in wonder and marveled at the hand of God at work in the birth of John, that people wondered what would become of this prophet, what would become of this life. But there are plenty of times that we sit waiting for God's will to be revealed, for an answer to prayer that's sometimes filled with anxiety or trepidation, awaiting the results of medical tests or awaiting a diagnosis, waiting for some long-awaited relief from suffering. Still, we wait in hope for the grace of God to be at work in us. That waiting part is incredibly difficult. But in the midst of the waiting, the hope itself is a gift. The hope itself is the reminder that we trust in God's power and God's providence, that we recognize that, as the psalmist has us pray today with Psalm 139, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. We don't always know how those gifts are going to manifest themselves in our lives, but we appreciate the gift nonetheless. Parents look upon the newborn child with great wonder, with great hope, not having any idea how the life of that newborn child will unfold and what God will make of that person with his gifts, with his grace to lead and to guide. And so hope is itself part of the gift because it has us focused on the deeds of God, the wonder, the power of God. However that happens, God's grace is revealed sometimes in suffering. And so we know the fulfillment of what would happen to John, ultimately the crown of martyrdom, with that tragedy with his being beheaded by Herod. We look to the example of Jesus, ultimately going to the cross, and we recognize that even in suffering, the hand of God can be at work in us. So as we give thanks for the birth of the Baptist today, even without knowing the answer to prayer, even without knowing how God's grace will unfold for us today, we give praise and thanks that God's grace is at work, no matter what befalls us. What's omitted from the gospel today is Zechariah's words of praise upon the birth of Jesus. His great canticle of praise that we call the Benedictus was our hymn as we began Mass this morning, that blesses God for his hand at work in wherever the Lord will lead us. And so at the beginning of the day, we can do nothing but give thanks as an act of hope and an act of trust at whatever God's grace will lead us to do, whatever we will face, difficult or easy, the hand of God is at work in us.